We think at the level of the European Council that this is an important gathering. Herman Van Rompuy sends you his best wishes. He couldn't be with you this evening himself because he's in, of all places, Brasilia conferring with President Lula. But he asked me, and I spoke with him a few minutes ago, to give you his best wishes for success. The more so because we think that your sector in our manufacturing industry is a crucial and a strategic one. You certainly have been comparing over the day your own growth rates with growth rates in other sectors and segments of our economy. And you must certainly have been seeing that, compared to them, you're doing rather well. It has a lot to do, I think, with one of the subjects I'd like to say a couple of words about: innovation, entrepreneurial prowess, the right kind of combination between labor and capital. And in that sense, I think a lot of lessons can be learned for the wider economy in Europe from your experience. Now, to give you, if you allow me, a few moments to go with you over our vantage point, which is the European Council, as it has been rejuvenated, if I may say so, after the Treaty of Lisbon, and which tries to become, and I think is successfully doing so, to try and be an important factor in increasing growth in our European Union. Because, as you know, without this growth, and your industry is an important factor, an important example of this growth, without this growth, our social model, our social security system, and our general way of life, which is typical for us in the European Union, which binds us all together, is probably unsustainable. If you allow me, I would like to say a couple of things about the general outlook of the European Council after 6 months, and then stay with you on 2 or 3 subjects we are delving into ourselves and which may, I suspect, to be of importance to, to your endeavors. Why this European Council? Why a permanent president in the person of the former Belgian Prime Minister? When we started enlarging the European Union, we are 27 now, and there is no end to it apparently, we discovered that in order to balance for the increased fragmentation and heterogeneity of this wider European Union, we had to concentrate more power in Brussels. Now, concentrating power is probably not politically very correct, and there's a lot of resistance against concentration of power. And that was the reason why we had to find an answer to this resistance against concentrating more power in Brussels, which we had to do because we had a wider, more fragmented European Union. There was a resistance on the side of democracy, on the side of popular consent, and there was a resistance on another level, at the level of capitals and states. So in the Treaty of Lisbon, and that's all I say on the subject, they strengthened the European Parliament, which, as you now may be discovering by reading the press daily, has had an enormous increase of power. That was the answer to the democratic deficit. The second thing the Treaty of Lisbon did was making a much stronger European Council, being the meeting of the heads of state and governments, making it into an institution, giving it a permanent president in the person of Herman Van Rompuy, because that was the answer to the fact that many capitals felt that they, as bearers of state sovereignty, felt that power was escaping too much towards Brussels. So that is the general framework we have been working in. Now, we started 6 or 7 months ago must say it was an exhilarating experience because nothing existed. I felt for once in my career, like some of you must have felt more often than I did, that starting with an operation from scratch is like starting a small or medium-sized enterprise in your backyard or in your garage. It was an exhilarating experience, but I'm not sure that I want to do that every 6 months over again. So that's where we are. What did we do? We concentrated mainly on the economy. The reason was obvious. We had the Greek monetary crisis. I could now write a novel on how this was dealt with. It's probably one of the greater crises of Europe. I think by and large, public authorities and governments and ourselves dealt with it in a way to prevent this particular monetary crisis into developing into a back-breaking economic crisis. But the end result was that we only did that. We did the economy. The other main subject of what we should be doing and will do is foreign policy, but that basically took second seat. Now, in the course of trying to rebuild our economic governance, the solidity of a monetary union, we have been dealing with 4 subjects which are of more immediate interest to your role in our economy. There is one on structural reform, there's one on innovation, there's one on climate, and there's one on energy. Those are the 4 points we are dealing with and which I think have some immediate relevance for your sector in the economy. First of all, structural reform. Now, everybody in this room knows that one of the drawbacks and one of the weaknesses of the European Union is that tendentially our competitiveness is too low. Now, it may be different from one country to another. I think Germany has succeeded at the end of the Schröder government in the Hartz IV agreements to restore competitiveness in the German economy, which I must say, for which you need a lot of political power, because as you may have seen, that was the reason why Chancellor Schröder lost the election. But still, everybody feels now more than ever that we should restore competitiveness. There are 2 ways to restore competitiveness: short term, long term. Long term is structural reform. Short term means that you make people work longer, you make them work more for less. That's exactly what Germany has been doing. And one can say, well, the Germans have been overdoing, but still, as a consequence of this crisis, there has been a shift mentally among heads of state and government. 2 years ago, people said, well, the Germans are producing surpluses, the other ones are having deficits, both are guilty. That's the word imbalance. Nowadays, the mentality in the minds of leaders has completely changed as a consequence of the crisis. Now nobody says the Germans are as much at fault as the ones in the southern part of the European Union. Now there is a dominant feeling that, no, the burden of the proof is on the ones who have lost competitiveness. And now, how do you regain competitiveness? Short-term measures, which are politically very sensitive, but many governments are in the process of taking them. Austerity measures, reductions in salaries, looking at your retirement age. Now, fortunately for them, as political leaders, big parts of the European public opinion is convinced that something has to be done. Because people have seen that if nothing is done, the real base of their way of life is in danger. So it's the moment or never to try in the short term to take unpopular measures, that's true, but still a lot of people feel that something has to be done, and it is now a window of opportunity to do so. That's short term on competitiveness. And we in the European Council have been pushing relentlessly all leaders to become aware of that, to accept that this is the moment to do that. And we are making headway. Competitiveness has another story to it, a long-term story. If you want to reestablish competitiveness, in the longer term, you need to make structural reforms. Now, structural reforms is one of these Chinese words we use in Brussels, but in reality it means that you have to do something about your education, you have to do something about your employment rate, you have to do something about innovation. So you will say, well, nothing new there. In 2000 in Lisbon, you said exactly that. So what's new there? Well, what Van Rompuy tried to do, and in which he has been successful, is to say, if we have a structural reform strategy, it's not by just putting a number of 25 objectives. That's never going to work. We try and take some key targets, and we have chosen 5 of them, and I mentioned a couple of them. And then secondly, and that's very important, we have to have a kind of a discipline where every single country has to present every year what it is doing in terms of overcoming its own structural handicaps. Now, what can these structural handicaps can be? You can have a bad university system. You can have the ring rond Antwerpen, which is not yet finished, because that's part of productivity and competitiveness as well. We call that in our Chinese bottlenecks. But we have now a system under which every country will be looked through a magnifying lens every year, and we will tell them that's where you have to do really something, because there you're losing out. That's my first point. The European Council, I think, is making an important difference in pushing governments into doing a lot of not very popular things, but which they have to do in order to preserve our economic and social system. That's my first point, I thought, which might be of some interest to you. Now, innovation is part of that reform. We have called a special European Council in December to discuss among heads of state and government on innovation. I think we try to push 3 questions. First of all, a discussion. What is missing in Europe? What is missing for us to be as innovative as other parts of the world? Now, a lot of the answers are known, but the discussion between heads and state and government means that their awareness and their sense of responsibility towards this question, we hope, will increase. Now, there are different factors, and I think in this room many of you are grappling with them on a daily basis. For instance, the accessibility or the availability of venture capital, which has to do with the fact that, and you know that a lot of financing of the economy, much bigger part of the financing of the economy in Europe happens through the banking system than in the United States, where stock markets and non-banking capital supplies are a much bigger part of the capital side of the economy. So another obvious problem is the European patent, which is held back, as you know, for linguistic reasons, which for once have nothing to do with Belgium. l'exception n'est pas la règle. And you can go on, there are a number of, and I just give you these two examples, but there are other factors, contributing factors, which, first of all, we should make our heads and masters or prime ministers and heads of state more familiar with what is hampering us. Now then this obvious question then is, what can you do about it? I think, and now I revert back to in part to my first point. We have now, thanks to this Agenda 2020, a system which can pressurize, push countries in looking in a sincere manner at the weaknesses and the bottlenecks which are hampering innovation and which are different from one country to another. Admittedly, if you take Finland, Germany, Holland and Belgium, it's a completely different ballgame from what you have in Spain, Greece, or the southern part of Italy. And the fact that we try to approach it to a country-specific basis is, I think, an important step forward. Not all governments are happy about that, because being named and shamed and being pinpointed is not the most pleasant experience politically. So innovation, yes, at the level of countries, we will become more severe with them. But the European Union has to do a couple of things as well. And the one which I think is the most important one has to do with the European patent. You know all the figures, a European patent is 10, 13, 14 times as costly, would be as costly, 10 to 14 times as costly as a patent in the United States. And a lot has to do, but not entirely, with the cost of translations and a lot with bureaucracy. I understand that the rotating Belgian presidency, which has taken over from the Spaniards in the beginning of the month, wants to make it an important issue, and they will have all support we can muster at the level of the European Council in December. Because if we cannot find a way to solve that one, either with 27 or with a smaller group, if we cannot solve the European patent, then I think we are not really serious about innovation. That's my second point. Climate. We will have another meeting in Cancun on the climate negotiation. This probably will not have the relevance or the visibility of the Copenhagen conference. Everybody came back from Copenhagen with burned fingers. I mean, you have there practically all heads of state of government of 2/3 of the world, and nothing very much was happening. So in the discussions, I was sitting in Toronto at the G8 and then the G20. It was obvious that most heads of state and government say, well, Cancun, let's see whether we make really progress, we keep it at ministerial level, and then the next UN conference on the subject will be, which will be a year later in South Africa, we'll see where we are. The question, the fundamental question, I think, the way at least we analyze it, is the following. You have in Europe two schools of thought. You have a group who says, we should go forward with CO2 emission improvement in Europe regardless. You have one school says, we should continue giving the good example. Those are the people who say you should go from a reduction of 20% to 30%, and that's a unilateralist kind of approach. Now, I hasten to add that, as far as I can gauge, that is a minority position. All the tests we have done is that the majority position says, no, we still have to try and have a meaningful negotiation, because, and so certain steps we Europeans can make, we are only going to make if others make steps as well. But then you come to the point where to say, well, how do you bring other people to make steps, which admittedly for them economically or politically are not easy steps? I had a long discussion with the Chinese ambassador to the European Union, who was chief of staff of the Chinese Prime Minister, and he said, listen, what we can do, we can reduce per unit output CO2 emissions by 45% by 2020. But mind you, in 2020, we expect the gross national product of China to be doubled. So basically what he was telling me was, we double our economy, but the level of CO2 emissions will more or less remain stable. Yeah, and then, I mean, the atmosphere probably is not seeing that the economy has doubled. The atmosphere is only seeing that the CO2 emissions are remain stable. Now, I was pushing him and saying, well, but listen, in the end you probably will have to do more. We know how sensitive you are to the fact that nobody else should tell you what to do. But tell me, if you would want to do more, if you were as the margin, and he said something which I found fascinating. He said, you know, we can only do that in our next 5-year plan. So in a way, they still have a communist era planning methodology in their economy, and say, well, we have a 5-year plan, we can only do something more in the next 5-year plan. Now, you can say you can love it or you can leave it. But I think if you want to negotiate and bring people to where you want them to be, you have always to try and understand their constraints and their constrictions. So we should think about when the next 5-year plan is being decided in Peking, and then we may have a meaningful dialogue. But the message I want to give to you is that the majority opinion at the time of speaking is we will continue to negotiate. Do we always have the leverage we would like to have? Not always. President Sarkozy will say just impose a carbon tax, carbon leakage tax. And there is a huge discussion going on in capitals about carbon leakage tax. And that is a difficult discussion because people say, yeah, if you start taxing imports because of the carbon emission conditions under which they have been produced in another country, how do you measure that? Mm-hmm. And aren't you beginning to put a lot of strains and stresses on the WTO free trading system? We know that, for instance, in Paris, there is a lot of interest of trying to do something in terms of border measures. There are even groups in the United States, as far as the United States are concerned, who are interested in that. But it is a very difficult discussion because it is part and parcel of the Doha round and the world free trade system. But again, at the time of speaking, the majority opinion is we should continue negotiating. It's going to take time, but we should not just abandon or give away the leverage we have in order to make, over time, this negotiation succeed. Now, again, this is the way I think the cards are on the table today. I think that's where they will stay, but you should know there is a group of people who say, let's do it unilaterally, and the force of the example and whole year then down. To finish my fourth point on energy. We are now preparing a European Council in the beginning of February on the energy. The last discussion which took place between heads of state and government about energy was a couple of years ago during the German presidency. We think we have again to make it a high priority focus of attention. The question then becomes, what are the real questions and what are the false questions? Nobody in Europe thinks it is a good discussion to try and harmonize or influence every country's energy production mix, which is another word to speak about nuclear power. The situation is so mixed up in each and every single country with the rapport de force and so on. Differently, so nobody in his right mind thinks that you can have a meaningful discussion at the level of heads of state of government on national energy mix, because the only thing you're going to be able to see is that everybody has his own recipe and that you cannot harmonize them. We think that the whole notion of energy independence is a false notion. The real notion is energy security. Because the idea that the European Union can become, in a way, autarkically independent as far as energy supplies are concerned, we think is a figment of the mind. So what are then the real questions? And again, I'm giving you a bit in this secluded group an indication on our state of thinking, which between then and now will evolve and be informed. I think there are two real questions in the energy, but I stand to be corrected. I think there are many people here who know more about the subject than I do. But having consulted with many people knowledgeable about the sector, we think there are two questions. First of all, the interconnections between gas and electricity systems. Because we all discovered when Ukraine closed the gas faucet, and particularly the Bulgarians who had no storage capacity found themselves in trouble, that it's very difficult in Europe to use your gas piping system in the reverse order. That transmission systems in electricity are not very well connected. Because why are they not connected? Because connection costs money, it's investment, and what is the yield on your investment? But I think if somewhere collectively public authorities can make a difference, it is there.